Welcome to HSBC Global Viewpoint, the podcast series that brings together business leaders and industry experts to explore the latest global insights, trends, and opportunities. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes. Thanks for listening, and now on to today's show.
You're listening to the Macro Brief, the podcast that looks at the issues driving financial markets across the globe. This episode was recorded for publication on the 28th of August 2025 by HSBC Global Investment Research. All the disclosures and disclaimers associated with it must be viewed on the link attached to your media player. And remember to like and subscribe to the Macro Brief wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, I'm Aline Van Dyne in our New York studio, and welcome to the Macro Brief from HSBC Global Investment Research. If you're a regular listener, you will know we look at the issues driving financial markets across the globe. And today we're looking at not one, but two of these important issues, AI and tariffs. We look at how the two may be connected in surprising ways and actually changing the way companies operate and behave. Indeed, we explain how AI and investments in AI and cost impacts could help offset up to a quarter of the increased costs related to tariffs. To shed light on how this all works, I'm joined in the studio by Alastair Pinder, our head emerging markets and global equities strategist. Alastair, good to have you back on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to discuss two of these big buzzwords in financial markets.
So let's get right to it. AI and tariffs, just give us a little bit of context. What do we need to know about them in terms of why they're important?
Well, for tariffs, the biggest, most important factor is, the fact that the effective tariff rate has increased by almost, depending on different estimates, but 16-17% since Trump's term. That is the biggest rise since the 1930s. And, that is clearly very problematic for US companies that we estimate probably import around 25% of their costs. So that's one issue.
And of course, most of these haven't quite kicked in or have only very recently kicked in.
Totally. And then the second aspect, you're talking about AI. I mean, AI has just become, I guess, so widely adopted across the US economy so rapidly. And the amount of spending that is going into this is just phenomenal. So if you take the Magnificent Seven, they are spending almost $100 billion a quarter on CapEx related to investments in AI, etc. And the other, surprising aspect is that construction spending on data centers has now nearly overtaking construction on general offices for the first time ever. So that, I think, just shows you the extent to which, the US economy has completely geared and the US equity market is completely geared towards AI at this point.
Now, of course, these are all costs at the moment, but presumably the reason this has propelled equity markets to record highs this year is because of the potential of all this AI investment down the line.
Totally. So there's two areas you can think about AI. One is the revenue generation, which is from the Magnificent Seven and these other AI-related companies. And again, focusing on that Magnificent Seven, we're already seeing revenue generation come through, and their earnings growth is phenomenal. It's almost 30% year on year every quarter. Probably the one underestimated impact of AI is actually on the end user and how that can essentially drive costs. We implement AI to become more efficient or even more scarily replace labor and employees, and they can do our job for us. That all in a drive to try and become more cost efficient.
Yes. So these are the impacts of AI. Clearly, there's no signs that this investment is slowing down. At the same time, there are these tariffs either looming or recently introduced, a big cost increase on companies. Why are the two related? Why does it really matter? Is it just calculating the costs and the potential benefits, or is there more of an interaction between these two?
Well, I think one of the interesting dynamics is, very much like during COVID-19, which spurred innovation and for companies to think completely differently to, navigate this sea change in really the world and how we operated. It's not, I don't think, too much of an exaggeration to say the level of tariffs that we're facing now for US companies is seismic, and they need to do things differently to basically offset that. And
so you're saying basically the risk or the impact on their costs is a catalyst to try and find an alternative way of doing things.
Completely. And so AI has come at this opportune moment where they can leverage it, they can invest in it, and they can save costs by doing that. And so that can be perhaps a counter effect to some of these margin pressures which they're facing at the moment.
Which also means, of course, that potentially the tariff increases, for example, are not directly passed on to consumers because there's other things going on behind the scenes.
Totally.
And this relationship between tariffs, margin pressure, and then the potential to cut costs from AI, is there any evidence that companies are actually speaking about this?
So there's lots of different evidence. So one is, the question is are more companies adopting or using AI? And the Bureau of Economic Analysis has a survey which essentially covers the whole of the US corporates, and they ask in that survey, are you using AI to in your daily business? And the percentage of companies that say yes has jumped from 6% at the end of last year to 9% now. So in a short span of the month, we've had a 50% increase in respondents saying yes, we're using AI. And that's coincided with, the recently implemented tariffs by the U.S. administration. There's also been another bunch of surveys from the Fed and more recently from the CEO survey, which explicitly asks the question, do or will tariffs incentivize you to invest more in AI? And the kind of resounding answer is yes.
Okay, so
probably.
It's a specific question asked.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then there's probably some room for differentiation here, because on that survey that I mentioned before from the BEA, 9% of companies using AI don't actually sound that much. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that it includes the whole of the US economy. So a lot of agricultural companies, some construction companies are included in that.
So it's a massive sample base.
It's a massive sample base. And they actually break it out by employee size. And it's also very interesting that large cap or companies with a large number of employees are much more likely to adopt AI. And if we take that to the extreme and we focus on the biggest companies in the US, which are in the S&P 500, there we think the adoption and usage of AI is much, much higher. And that's because, namely, of that different skew in sectors. So there's more financial companies, there's more tech companies. These are all companies that are much more likely to adopt AI because the cost efficiencies and the way to use it is much more applicable. But it's also because they're just bigger and have more money to invest. But our estimates suggest that around 60% of S&P 500 companies are currently investing in AI right now as a way to basically try and save costs.
So survey indicates 9% rapid increase, but actually it totally understates what's happening in the S&P 500
in the equity
companies.
Market, totally.
Okay. And I know you've published reports on this, of course. You've also looked at actual company commentary on earnings calls to identify what management is saying. So just talk us through some of those conclusions.
Well, I think one of the questions that we get a lot from investors is that AI mentioned all the time, amazing buzzword, but what's the proof? How are companies basically, implementing this, and to what extent are they saving money? And so we did kind of a deep dive analysis on S&P 500 earnings calls, and we looked specifically for very tangible examples of the savings that companies have made from implementing AI. And there was two, I guess, very interesting things that came out of this. One is that in our sample of nearly 50 companies, on average, they basically suggested that by implementing AI, they could reduce their costs by 1%. Now, 1% doesn't sound like a huge amount, but just to put that into perspective, that can probably offset 20 to 25% of the increase from tariffs. So
that's from 20% tariff.
Yeah. So, if you think about a 20% tariff, if 25% of their costs are imported, roughly speaking, that's a 5% increase in costs. If AI can reduce 1% of that, roughly, a fifth to a quarter of those costs can basically be offset. Now, the other thing just...
And that's over the next couple of years?
That actually is a mixture of what's already happened and is upcoming.
Okay.
And that, I think, is the interesting part, because obviously earnings call commentary is often quite backward-looking, and this is still very early stage. So over the next 6 to 12 months, I would expect the adoption of AI and the more tangible examples to actually come through, and the effectiveness of those AI programs to actually become bigger and better.
So basically, given this scenario now, and given that tariffs clearly are here to stay, there continue to be negotiations with various countries, but clearly implementation has started already. Watching this dynamic will be quite important in the coming months.
Definitely. And, I think the other thing that we highlight within, the US equity market is that I do think this is a very underappreciated story. Mm-hmm. So, the Magnificent Seven and the different sort of, AI infrastructure stories or the AI enablers have rallied, anywhere between 60 to even, 150% over the last 2 years. But the early adopters of AI are probably up around 20 to 30%. And so it feels like the market isn't taking enough notice of these companies that are actively engaged in using AI from a cost perspective.
Okay, great. Well, look, Alastair, that's really interesting. I do hope that we can follow up in a few months when we have a bit more data. And as we continue to see how tariffs and the looming higher costs is actually changing behavior or perhaps encouraging some innovation across the US.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alastair. Now, listeners, a date for your diary. The next edition of our Live Insights on LinkedIn will be taking place on the 10th of September. Dara Ma, Head of Digital Assets Research, and Piers Butler, my co-host and Head of Global Research Direct, take a deep dive into the evolving world of digital assets. And a reminder that if you're an HSBC Global Investment Research client, don't forget to download our mobile app. The app features all of our latest research, videos, and podcasts, this one as well as others. You can find it on Apple's App Store and Google Play. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so by emailing us at askresearch@hsbc.com. That's all for this week. Please join us again soon for more insights and views on the Macro Brief.
Thank you for joining us at HSBC Global Viewpoint. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes.